So after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the whole tradition of Byzantine sacred art began to go into decline. And as we've seen, one of the major forces behind the aesthetic excellence of the tradition was Constantinople, or the imperial court, wherever it happened to be, as a center of culture. And when that ceased to be the case, the tradition, so to speak, lost its center of gravity. The regional schools that have always really been there, the Balkans, the Russian tradition, lost their center of gravity, lost this centralizing, high-quality influence, and they began to parochialize. They began to become more idiosyncratic, more insular, and we enter into the sub-Byzantine or post-Byzantine period of the rise of the regional schools. And it's a slow story. It's a slow development of post-Byzantine to what eventually ends up being what we could even call a folk art style. So some of these regional schools are things like the Cretan school, icon painting on the island of Crete, which is still alive and well today. And of all the schools, I think the Cretan school preserved a lot of the Byzantine tradition, or at least tried to for the first few centuries after the fall. Some of you may know that the Renaissance painter El Greco, which just means the Greek, started off his painting career as an icon painter in Crete, eventually migrating to Italy and eventually settling in Spain. And a lot of scholars have looked at his work and saw the influence of that Cretan icon painting. And the Cretan school is really known for its high stylization. So it loses some of the classical formalism of Constantinople, but it does preserve a lot of the sort of hesychast immediacy of the brush strokes and the heavy line work. So this Cretan school continues to develop certain aspects of late Byzantine painting. Other aspects kind of migrate north, and we have, of course, the Balkan icon painting that we've spoken a lot about, but also we have icon painting moving even further north into the Carpathian Mountains, into Romania, that developed its own particular aesthetic, and then finally into Ukraine, which developed its own particular aesthetic, and of course the continuing development of the Russian icon. At this time we get the very idiosyncratic tradition of the Muscovite icon, which sort of loses all contact with Constantinople after Andrei Rublev and the Paleologian Renaissance, transmitted to the Rus. So the whole tradition of Russian icon painting sort of takes its own trajectory and is no longer in contact with the center of gravity. One of the features that all of these post-Byzantine schools have in common is that even though they preserved the Byzantine tradition both technically and aesthetically at first, eventually all of them adopt a more Western aesthetic and significantly begin to use the Western medium of oil paint. Now, technically speaking, you can paint an icon in any medium that you want. But as we've discussed so often throughout our lectures, and particularly in our technical lectures, the medium really does or needs to cooperate with the theological and aesthetic aims of the icon. It has to cooperate with how the icon is speaking. And atempera works perfectly for that. Oil paints, on the other hand, I think allow for different aesthetic sensibilities that aren't as important in the iconographic language. Oil painting allows for hypernaturalism, almost a photographic realism if you're really good, which is wonderful, but not as important to the icon. It also allows for a wonderful expression of mood. Think of the paintings of Caravaggio, where he has that intense light and dark, that almost theatrical feel. It allows for atmospheric perspective. That's what Leonardo da Vinci was trying to develop in a lot of his work. So there's many wonderful things about oil painting, but it's perhaps not the right medium to communicate the language that the icon speaks. So throughout this period of Western influence, We see mostly failed attempts at a synthesis. We see icons that are trying to speak two aesthetic languages, but not succeeding in either language. So they really fail to communicate in a certain level of depth that the Byzantine style is capable of, really. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are paintings of genuine religious feeling, of artistic excellence that do come out of Romania, come out of later in Russia, and also actually in Greek icon painting. The icon painters of the late 1800s and early 1900s who are working in a more of a Western style, they do produce images of great religious feeling. But there's always a sense, or really a reality, that these are imitations. These are speaking an aesthetic language that didn't organically develop out of orthodoxy. And eventually this style, for a variety of reasons, both historical and theological, reaches a dead end. But one of the more serious aspects of oil painting that led to a decline in the aesthetic standards of the tradition really is that oil painting does require a high degree of technical skill, technical excellence. Part of the reason these Italian masters became the masters that we know them to be is they were all working in cities like Florence and later Rome and later Venice, competing with one another, but also learning from one another, and really mastering their craft. Later on, you have the famous the art schools of Paris, where students would have to draw for years and then paint for years and start, as apprentices. And by the time they got to be a painter, they had just an unfathomable degree of excellence that really we can't even match in the modern period. We do have obviously people who work in oils, but it is seldom that they can match, let alone exceed, what was achieved in the past. And really it came down to that high standard of training. And that high standard of training is exactly what we didn't have in the East, in Eastern Europe, where there was not the cash flow, if you want to put it that way, to sustain that level of cultural production. So as the medium shifts to oil paint, the aesthetic standards, or the ability to develop the skill to have the high aesthetic standards, also starts to decline. So this whole phase of Western aesthetic influence in Byzantine icons does come to an end, and it comes to a rather climactic end with World War I. So in World War I, we have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Even though that's good news for the Orthodox Christian populations living under the Ottomans, it also leads to a lot of political instability. But more dramatically, we have the collapse of Tsarist Russia. We have the end of a Christian civilization that, at least tries to trace its roots all the way back to Byzantium. Now, granted, Russia, for centuries before the fall of the Tsar, had as its official policy an imitation of the West. You had, even to the very end of the Russian Tsarist state, icon painters that were passionately committed to this Western aesthetic and the new possibilities for Russian religiosity that it afforded. But we also see other cultural currents develop in Russia towards the end of the Tsarist state, and they're currents that are self-confident in Russian culture. We have the great literary classics of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but you also have an intellectual renaissance that happens of the Slavophiles, or Russian philosophers. And part of this mix, this Slavophile mix, is an appreciation for the indigenous Russian aesthetic and the traditional icon. So Russians beginning to rediscover its own cultural heritage, even though it's a sub-Byzantine sort of folkish heritage at first, right as the empire collapses. And a lot of those intellectuals that were on the vanguard of this intellectual movement, they're the first ones shipped out of Bolshevik Russia. The Marxists, at least at first, don't want anything to do with it. They're international Marxists. This is class warfare. You can't have regional or local commitments. That's not part of Marxism. That will become part of later Bolshevik or really Marxist ideology under Stalin, but at this point, that is not welcome in the new Bolshevik state. So a lot of these intellectuals find themselves in Paris or in London. And in these, cultural capitals of Europe that, they find themselves, this great Russian diaspora, they also discover that there's been tremendous shifts in Western art theory, in Western aesthetics, that allow for something of a rapprochement, a discovery of the traditional icon in this diaspora, in Westerners themselves. So we do see in this period shifts in Western art, in Western art theory, that do allow for a glimpse into the icon. One movement we can say is Romanticism, this love for a nostalgic memory of the past, which the Slavophiles maybe are an expression of, but this is a general movement in European culture. But there's also other movements, the most famous being Expressionism or abstraction, this desire to move away from natural depiction, or at least point to any time you do a naturalistic depiction, it is a fooling of the eye. So there's this movement, particularly among the French, of abstraction, of being self-confident in the fact that a painting does not have to accurately depict reality. Now, painters have always known that. The masters of hyperrealism understand that their paintings are actually too real to be real. That's why we interpret them as real. But really, it was the arrival of the photograph in Europe that allowed art to really step away from this perceived task of accurately representing an image of what is seen. Also, we have things like primitivism, this attempt at least to be unschooled or self-schooled. There's this love for sort of aboriginal, that term might not be PC today, but there is this real desire to have this aboriginal or naive aesthetic. So all of these currents in Western art really allowed for a very fruitful time of encounter between the Byzantine icon, particularly in its Russian form, and Western intellectual, Western intelligentsia. Now, I'm not saying that the Byzantine icon is or really fits into a lot of these artistic theories, abstraction, expressionism. The icon is very clearly operating under its own theoretical framework, so it is not an example of abstraction. I've seen, abstract artists try to imitate icons, and it really is speaking two languages, but they're languages that are mutually intelligible to a certain extent. So it allows for a rediscovery of the icon, but also a rediscovery of the icon from the point of view of the Russian intellectuals, or later on the Greek intellectuals, where they're now abandoning this need to imitate the West and really valuing their own artistic tradition. So some of the major figures in this rediscovery of the Byzantine icon, in the Greek world, we have Fotis Kontoglou, very interesting character, very interesting life. But what Fotis does is he rediscovers a lot of the technical aspects of the Byzantine icon, tries to rediscover working with brushstrokes, getting away from oil painting and blending and the things that the icon painters were doing, very heavily relying on the Cretan school. I don't particularly care for his work, but he did help to reinvigorate the tradition in Greece. His books are very famous, and his work, even though it might not represent sort of a high level of aesthetic excellence, it was, in the Greek-speaking world, the rediscovery of the Byzantine tradition. In Russia, it was a little different. It was a little different because the rediscovery really happened in the diaspora, in the exile. So there were attempts to rediscover the tradition, but it had to go almost through the folk tradition. So, like we've already discussed, we had this interest in Romanticism, this interest in Slavophiles, lovers of Slavic culture. So we do have a revival of the Russian folk icon. And that actually goes on for a few decades. But eventually, a lot of these Russian icon painters realize that the tradition is deeper than a folk art style. The aesthetic standards can be higher than what they were in the folkish iconography. So there were many figures involved in recovering the iconographic tradition in the Russian diaspora and also back in Russia itself. There's a wonderful book entitled, I don't know if you can see it, Hidden and Triumphant. And it sort of analyzes this whole period of Russian artistic culture. So there's a lot of figures involved, but one I want to focus in on is a very famous iconographer, Father Xenon. Now, Father Xenon studied the icon in the Soviet Union, and he basically learned how to paint the icon not as a religious person, but as a good Soviet who wanted to preserve his ethnic heritage. So he was sent to school to learn the Byzantine icon painting, but in a completely completely secularized context. So eventually, Father Xenon did discover the faith and become, a priest of the church, but it did start in this secularized context, and that was actually very common. The whole tradition in Russian folk art of the painting of the little boxes, that actually came from icon painters needing something to do and to preserve the technical, capabilities. That was not religious, so they turned to folk themes. And later on, the Soviets became more and more open, as I've hinted, to Russian sort of ethnic tradition, and they did allow for the preservation of these traditions, but as a purely secular enterprise. So that's where Father Xenon first learned, and he learned a very folkish style. But that was really just the beginning of Father Xenon's artistic and theoretical journey. As the Soviet Union began to collapse, and as his faith deepened, and as the possibility of orthodoxy reviving in Russia became a real possibility, Father Xenon realized that this folkish art really couldn't take Russian orthodoxy to the depth that it needed to go. Not that this art is bad or it's not filled with religious feeling, but in Father Xenon's mind, the rupture that the Soviet Union represented was too great. This organic tradition that dates all the way back to the first evangelization of the Rus, it came to an end. It was severed with the fall of the Tsars. There was icon painting, obviously, that happened after that, but for Father Xenon to just go back where they left off didn't represent the deep continuity that he believed Russia needed for orthodoxy to fully revived. So he began to shift, and his philosophy was, no, we need to go all the way back to that original inception. We need to go back to the Byzantine originals. We need to go back to even to the Middle Byzantine aesthetic for a new inception of the tradition in a revived Russian Orthodoxy. So he began to explore these very traditional techniques where it was no longer about folkishness, but getting back to that pure, high aesthetic quality Byzantine style. And his work and also his philosophy, his approach, mirrored in many ways the developments I spoke briefly that were going on in Greece. And he became almost how I think of him as the great-grandfather of all contemporary icon painters. Father Xenon was also very influential and very important to icon painters who are living outside of a traditionally Orthodox land. Because, of course, icon painters in the United States, where I live, we have no indigenous Orthodox tradition. So this idea of going back to the high point of Byzantine art really resonated with a lot of iconographers really all around the world. So not only was there a tremendous resurgence of the icon and very traditional techniques in the East, in the former Soviet Union and in Greece, but also for the first time in the West. And again, there were several factors for this emergence of the icon in the West. One being that, again, icons had risen in prominence because of the scholarship and the theology that had surrounded them. So icons became almost prestigious as sort of a highly intellectual, highly spiritual art form that became very, very popular in the West. But I think one of the more fundamental motivating factors is we touched briefly on different art currents in Western Europe that allowed for people to approach iconography really for the first time since the High Italian Renaissance as an art form in and of itself with its own theoretical framework. But we have to point out that those same currents in Western art theory also did represent a break in the continuity of Western sacred art. Really, since the High Renaissance, Western sacred art had really wed itself to first a very naturalistic style, but also really wedded itself and became dependent upon an artistic class that had a just extraordinary talent. And as art changed over time in the West, the church found itself in a situation where it didn't have artisans readily available that could execute this art. As Western European art moved away from naturalism and moved away from the training that it provided the skill level to effectively deploy that style, the church found itself in a situation where it just couldn't maintain this tradition any longer. So we see a decline in the quality of Western sacred art. And even more maybe serious than that is the shifts in philosophy. It was also really wedded with the shifts that were going on in ideology. So it wasn't really, or it wasn't even so much that Western artists were turning away from a style that the Western church had become accustomed to, but ideologically they were actually opposed to even producing the art. So all of these factors really led to a dramatic decline in the quality and availability of Western sacred art, and also its dependence on artists as a class. It wound up not being very sustainable. So a lot of people in Western Europe turned to Byzantine iconography in particular as a way to reestablish a continuity, a way to get back to a thoroughly Christianized artistic tradition where you don't have to battle with the ideology of the artists. So the art in this period, it's very hit or miss. Sometimes you have sort of this modernism that isn't cooperating with the faith very well. Sometimes it's attempts at an older style of Western art, but the skill level is not quite there, so it winds up looking kitsch or just overly sentimental. But a new current, a new available option is just a return to this Byzantine style. And there's a lot of people working all over Europe doing this, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church. But also there were other iconographers also sort of pursuing this Byzantine iconography as a way to reestablish a continuity. One iconographer I would just draw your attention to, a very famous iconographer, is Aidan Hart, and he's a British Orthodox Christian. But in his work, he does have that that philosophy of reaching back into that very that inception moment of that high Byzantine style, but also he's influenced by the indigenous British aesthetic, and even directly from the British iconography. And for people like Hart and a lot of Brits in particular, they really see the iconographic style as pointing to a pre-divided Christendom. Britain for centuries was part of what we would have considered the Orthodox world, and Aidan Hart really draws on that historical reality in his iconography. So just as it was allowing Roman Catholics to re-access a sacred tradition that had been ruptured by modernism, it was also allowing people in various localities to re-access a tradition that dates back even to pre-schism. So iconography all over the world was really allowing people to root artistically and visually into a sacred tradition. And this, of course, as I've mentioned, was also true of people who lived outside of historically Christian regions, or at least traditional Christian regions, like people in the United States, like myself. So the iconography allows for this establishment of continuity that is very powerful, and that's one of the reasons it became increasingly popular as we move into the 80s, 90s, and definitely into the 2000s. So in our day, we really are living through a tremendous revival and even renaissance of the iconographic tradition. I would state, quite straightforwardly that there are more iconographers of significant talent working today than at any other point really in history. I mean, it's almost astonishing what's going on today. And it does actually remind me a lot of the Italian Renaissance. And that's really, allowed for by the internet. So just like in the Renaissance, you had different artists, all vying against each other in the same cities and spying on each other and seeing, so-and-so was doing this technique and so-and-so was trying to develop that. Today we have something similar with the internet. We can instantly see not only the best prototypes of the entire history of the tradition, but we have instant access to all the materials needed to execute high-quality iconography. And we can also see what everyone is doing. There's lots of forums. I'm thinking of the Orthodox Art Journal. That's a tremendous resource. So we do have a situation now where everyone's seeing what everyone else is doing. Everyone's gleaning from everyone else. And the quality, the technical quality of the tradition is really just heading into unseen levels, or at least levels that haven't been seen since some of these golden ages, like the Middle Byzantine or the Age of Justinian or the Paleologian period. So it's really very exciting that we're living through this Renaissance, that someone like me and other people like me, can devote so much of our time and energy. And there are, obviously full-time iconographers today that really wouldn't have been possible even a few decades ago. So we are living through the revival of the tradition. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. This whole lecture has been giving reasons behind that. But other than the tremendous demand coming out of Eastern Europe with all the new churches being built and restored, we also have to think about the churches in the quote-unquote diaspora. My patriarch a few years ago gave a talk in the United States, and he basically declared that our church in the U.S. was no longer considered the diaspora. It's just the church. I heard some statistics that there are more Christians born in the Holy Land living in Australia than there are in the Holy Land. So Christianity or Orthodox Christianity came to the Western world as refugees, as migrants, as ethnic enclaves, decades ago, but it really has taken root. And what we're finding in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil, is that a lot of these communities are beginning to age out of those very humble buildings that served them well for all those years as refugee communities, as ethnic enclaves. So there's a tremendous demand for church redecoration and for new buildings, which makes, iconography also puts a demand on the iconography. I myself have been involved in many, many restoration projects, and a lot of those projects were, parishes that started off as ethnic parishes and maybe still have a very ethnic flavor to them, but the communities have matured and now they want to sort of level up in their iconography because now they can afford to. So that's another demand that I only see increasing in the United States as Orthodoxy becomes more established, and the consciousness of what is possible in iconography, especially in our day, starts to rise. So I think that's a good place to stop. Today we really are living through the renaissance of the tradition, and it's an unexpected renaissance. It's an anti-tragic renaissance of the tradition, which is a good thing. So that's where we'll leave it.